Hi there. About a couple months ago, I was on the VRChat forums and someone had a question about how to return pens to an area if a player takes them out of said area. So they wanted their pens to be constrained to a single room or a single part of the world, and they didn't want players taking those pens to a different part of the world and hiding them. I didn't know how to do this at the time, but I was learning how to make worlds, so I decided to take a shot at it. And I made a video on how to do that, on how I found out how to do that. It wasn't perfect, but it worked for what we needed it for. Unfortunately, in that video, I made a lot of mistakes because there's a lot of things I didn't know about world building that I do now. And as well as that, yesterday there was an update to the SDK that allows the method of making this happen a lot simpler. So in this video, I'm gonna go ahead and explain the mistakes that I made and how to correct them, as well as some extra information on building worlds that is related to that. And then we're gonna go ahead and solve the issue in a much cleaner way, a much nicer and easier way, which is great. But yeah, I'm gonna also try to keep this video as quick as I can. It's still probably gonna take some time to explain because there's a lot of things I still want to explain. But I'm gonna kind of go through some things pretty quickly that I mentioned in the last video. So I do recommend watching that one, even though it's a worse solution to this problem. You'll probably learn about a lot of things that you won't learn here. However, if this is, you just want to solve this respawning issue with pickup objects, this should be fine. This should be a good enough video. So yeah, let's get to it. First, I'm going to explain the mistakes I made and how to correct them and prevent them in the future. So, in the previous video, I mostly dealt with triggers that covered large areas. So I'll just show an example that if I take a cube here and I like to apply a specific material to my triggers, so I'm going to put that material on and I'll make it a trigger even though we're not actually going to do anything with this cube. And also I'm going to make it cover this area, this white portion of the area. Okay. So yeah, in that video I said, hey, one of the solutions is to have a trigger that covers your whole room, and then when the player exits the room, you'll have a trigger that says on exit trigger, which tells it, hey, when you exit this room, do this thing. And that is totally fine on desktop. Desktop users will have no issue with this, but VR users might. And the reason for this is, and let me just drop a coffee mug down here, which is my test object. Let's say this is a pickup. We will make it a pickup later, but we're imagining that it's a pickup right now. So you can go over to it, you can grab it, you can pick it up. Like I said, desktop users in this scenario will have no issue. They can go over and they can pick it right up. However, VR users might have issue. They might be able to pick it up, but it might be difficult for them. Or it might be impossible. It may not be possible at all to actually pick this up. And this goes for other interactable objects like doors and buttons and all that. And the reason for this is because the way VRChat calculates what a desktop user is looking at seems to be different than how a VR user calculates what they're trying to grab. I believe what happens with a desktop user is it uses what's called a raycast, which means it basically just sends a line straight forward from the middle of your face, the middle of your eyeballs, straight forward until it hits something. So the player's here, their face is up here, and they're looking at this mug, and it just sends a line straight forward, and then it hits the mug, and it says, oh, okay, that's the object we're trying to interact with, and it stops there. I believe what happens with VR users, though, is they probably have sphere colliders around their hands, maybe, so like this. And instead of doing a raycast, it's just doing a regular like collision detection. And you would think, okay, well, they hover over this mug, and it knows, okay, it's colliding with this mug, pick that up. But, and I could be wrong here because I don't actually know, but it seems that whatever the sphere is colliding with first is what it wants to pick up, or what it wants to interact with, even if it's not interactable. So this trigger out here that's covering the whole room is still a trigger. It's still a collider. And even though like you can't interact with it, you can't click on it, you can't do anything, this hand, this VR user's hand is in here, and it's seeing this first. So it's like, okay, that's the thing I want to interact with. Don't worry about anything else in here. We're already touching the thing we interact with. So even though we may be touching this mug, it's seen this first, and it may not be able to actually interact with this. So what you want to do in that situation is you want to have things as much as possible surrounding your area, so different triggers surrounding an area, but not actually taking up the whole area. So we'll get into it later, but what we're gonna do with our pens is we're gonna surround the area like this, and we'll make one for the ceiling and one for the floor as well. But we're gonna surround an area like this. That way, it's surrounding the room, and you can make it so upon entering the room or exiting it or whatever you need to, it'll trigger what we need to, but it's not causing a collider that will fight over VR users' hands, basically. Another thing I want to note about this is it's really good design in VRChat to do what I just said, but also if you have something that toggles, right? So let's say you want to, and you have your user enter a room, and upon entering the room, you want the lights to toggle on. I suggest avoiding toggles as much as possible, unless it's a button. That's a little different, but with triggers that you just walk into, I don't recommend that. And I'll explain why here. And we'll make this trigger a little bit fatter, so it's a little bit easier to explain. So let's say that this trigger here, upon entering it, and let's say there's walls here, and this is a room, and this is the only entrance to your room. And when you want so when the player enters this trigger and enters the room, the lights turn on, and when they leave it, the lights turn off. So let's take out a capsule and interact with this. So let's say this is our player. The lights are off in this room, and this is the only way to enter. They start walking in, they hit this trigger, and so they're entering the room, and then the lights turn on, and that's great. So this is set to a toggle, so they're in the room now, and then they're like, okay, I'm gonna leave now. They turn around and they go to leave. It hits the trigger. Once again, it toggles the lights. The same trigger, it's only a toggle. The lights turn off, and that's great. But what happens if they go here, they hit the trigger, the lights turn on, but they stop here? They're still inside the trigger, so they can't trigger it again until they leave it. And they decide to turn around and just leave. The lights are still on because they did not hit this trigger more than once. They didn't exit it, so they can't enter it again. And so next time they go to enter the room, the lights are on, they hit the trigger again, and it toggles them off. The way to solve this problem is you have to make things not a toggle. You have to have it, one trigger turns it on and one trigger turns it off. So the best way to do that is to have two triggers, right? So this one, let's say this is a hallway. There's an imaginary hallway here that makes it so the user can't actually go anywhere else other than through these triggers. So this one turns the lights off, this one turns it on. The player enters this one, the lights are already off, so this doesn't actually do anything. Then they enter this one, and the lights turn on. Then when they go to leave, they hit this trigger again, and even though they are still technically inside this trigger, this one turns it off, and you're good. You don't have to worry about that. I recommend, if you do this method, spacing these apart though, to make sure that the user can't touch both triggers at once. In that scenario, that theoretical situation, it wouldn't be an issue, but there are situations where it might be. Actually, the initial situation that I mentioned, like if they're touching both triggers, like this off trigger is still going, and then this turns it on, they're still within the off trigger and they can leave and it won't turn it on. So yeah, that's really doesn't have to do much with what we're saying today, but it's related to what I mentioned, and it's good knowledge to have. Also, if you're using this method, make sure you have a trigger at spawn that does anything that you want this exit trigger to do. And that's because people can respawn while they're in here and completely miss this trigger. Okay, so now that I've explained that, let's actually get to the problem at hand. So we've got this mug here, and let's turn it into a pickup before we do anything else. So I remove the animator because it's not necessary for this right here. And I'm going to add a couple things. First, I'm going to add a collider to it. Now I'm going to add a box collider, but let me show you what a mesh collider is in case you don't know, and explain that, because it's very important. A mesh collider, what it does, and I'm going to set it to convex here, what you want to do if you're making a pickup anyway. You'll see that this collider is doing its best to stay to the shape of the mug. And that's great because the collisions will be fairly accurate to the mug itself. So if it's laying here with the mug like handle, the mug handle can prop it up and it'll lay here a little bit. And if it's directly on this side, it'll lay there instead of in a weird fashion, and it'll roll kind of nicely. But the problem with that is mesh colliders are expensive. It costs a lot to do any collisions that are not a box. Boxes are really simple, and it's really simple to do the math on those collisions. Whereas a mesh collider, like, there are all these vertices, there's all these lines, and it has to do a calculation with all of these. And so if you only have one object in your world as a mesh collider, it's going to be fine. Depending on the mesh, I guess. But if you have a ton of them, it starts to lag really quickly. So I recommend anytime you can get away with it, and you'll get away with it way more often than you might expect, is putting a box collider on it. You just want to basically take a box collider and adjust it so it's the basic shape of what you're working with. So in this case, the handle will clip through the ground if it lands on that side, but honestly, that's kind of that's an acceptable, like, weird thing. People aren't really going to look at that and be like, oh geez, the handle's through the ground. It'll be fine, and it'll work a lot better. So yeah, we're using a box collider. Next, what I'm going to do is add a VRChat pickup object, which will automatically add a rigid body as well, which is necessary for physics. And I'm going to keep everything at the defaults because it's not necessary to change it with what we're doing. And finally, I'm going to add an object sync. And what that'll do is it'll make sure that the physics and everything is synced between all the players in the world. So I could do a build right now if I wanted to, and you would see that I could pick up this mug and throw it around, do whatever I want with it. But what we want to do is make it so it will not leave this area. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to make a trigger to test with. So I'm going to make a cube, and like I did before, I'm going to add a material to it. I use this material for all my triggers. The reason for that is I like to be able to see where my triggers are when I'm working on a map, and then when I'm ready to actually build the map, I just turn off this mesh renderer, which will make it invisible, but it'll still make it functional. So yeah, I'll turn that back on, and I'm going to make sure that this is actually a trigger, so it won't actually collide with anything, but it will do collision detections by clicking this checkbox. Okay, so let's take that and just move it over here, and we'll play around with that in a minute. But there's one more thing we need to do with it, and we need to change its layer. You'll see here I have a layer named pen respawn, and I'll go ahead and show how to change that. So what I did there, that was a little quick, I went to layer up here, I hit add layer, and now you're in the layer menu. VRChat uses all these layers, so don't change any of these, but any of the remaining 9 or so, I believe it's 9, it's free reign. You can do whatever you want with it. So what I did here is I just named a layer pen respawn, because we're gonna theoretically be respawning pens, even though it's a mug. But you can name this whatever you want. You can have a general purpose trigger that maybe it's just a general respawn pickup trigger that you're using specifically for any pickups you want to respawn. or it could be a very, very general trigger that will only be used in certain scenarios depending where you are in the world, and you could just name it trigger 1 or anything like that. I'm going to keep it at pen respawn, just because that is the only thing it's going to be used for in this case. So now that I've made that layer, I'm actually going to go to the layer again and then set it to that layer. Cool. So now what we're going to do is actually going to go right back to the coffee mug. We have to add triggers to this to make sure it responds, because now as it is, you could pick up the mug and take it over here, but it wouldn't do anything. It would just fall right through. So we're going to add component, and we're going to look up a VRChat trigger. Now the things we're going to be adding to this, we're going to add an on enter trigger, and that will trigger whenever it enters another trigger. So this is a trigger, and this is a VRChat trigger. The terminology is weird, so try your best to keep up. But yeah, so whenever this object enters this trigger, or any trigger at this moment, this action will happen. And what we're going to do here is we're going to add the layer to that layer we just made, and that'll make it so even if there was another trigger, right? Let's say we had another trigger and this was set to the default layer. The action we're taking here when it hits this will happen because it's on that layer we set, but it will not happen with this because it's a different layer. So now that we have that set up, let's talk about our actions. What we want to happen once the mug enters that trigger is we want the player to drop it, and we want it then to teleport back to a spawn point. So before we set up those actions, I'm actually going to set a spawn point because it needs an object to spawn to. So I'm going to right click on the mug itself and create empty. And what that'll do is it'll put that game object right in the center of this mug, because this is actually where I want it to respawn. Another way to do this is to create empty over here, and let's say it's somewhere over here, right? You can click and drag this onto the coffee mug itself, which will make it a child of it, and then you can go up here this cog and hit reset, and that'll make it centered relative to the mug. And then what we can do is just drag it out of that to make it its own game object, so it's not a child of the mug. Then another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an icon to it, because there's nothing physical showing where this is. That way when I'm in Unity I can see where it is. And lastly, we're going to just name it, and you can rename things by clicking on the object and pressing F2 on your keyboard. We're just going to name it spawn point. It might be better if you're actually making a world to say, hey, pen respawn point, or something along those lines that's more specific, but for our purposes we're just going to name it spawn point. Cool. So let's go back to our mug. We have this on enter trigger set to the pen respawn, and now we're going to add our drop and teleport actions. So first what we're going to do is click this plus and go to basic events. Sorry, not basic events, but events from scene. And then we're going to find our mug, and for the drop object, or the drop action, we're going to choose any of these. It doesn't matter which one, because once it's on there, we're going to change it. It just doesn't show up in this menu for some reason. You have to go to any of them, and I'm going to choose teleport to. Then you have to click on it, and down here where it says method, you can then change it to a pickup drop. I don't know why it's like that. They just added it, so there's a chance that it was just a mistake, but that's how you do that. Cool. And now another thing we want to do here before we go any farther is we want to enter advanced mode up here. And the reason for that is right now the trigger type is always buffer1, which it's complex to explain, but basically this means it'll trigger for everyone, and we want it to be local, meaning it'll only trigger on your specific game client. So if we go to advanced mode here, we will now have the option to make it local, as well as having the target here on this to be local as well. This up here may not need to be local. You may only need to change this one. I haven't done testing in multiplayer yet, like with multiple people. But theoretically, you may be able to change this one if things are going wrong. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, so that's our drop. That'll make it so if we are holding this pickup, we will bring it over here and touch this trigger, and then it'll drop. It will not respawn just yet, but as of currently, if we were to build the game or build the world, it would drop upon entering that trigger. Okay, so next we're going to add another plus and then another events from scene, and we are going to actually do a teleport to this time. We're not going to change it. We're actually going to keep the teleport to, and we're going to keep these all at defaults, and then we're going to add a location that it's going to teleport to. And so we're just going to take our spawn point and drag it right in there. Okay, so that's it. Now when we take this mug and it touches this while we're holding it, it'll force us to drop it, and it'll teleport right back to where it started. And let's go ahead and do a build and see that in action. So I'm going to show the build control panel. It's on a different monitor, so you won't be able to see that happen. But yeah, while that's building, let's just go over what we've done. We've made a pickup object. It's a mug in our case, but a pen in the theoretical situation. And we've made it so you can pick it up, and upon entering any trigger that is on the layer pen respawn, it will then force you to drop that pickup, and it will spawn it where we want it. Okay, cool. So now we're in VRChat, and we can see our mug. We can pick it up. We can do whatever we want with it. And as soon as it touches this box, it's going to force it to drop and teleport back. And there you go. It works perfectly. If I were to just throw it in, it still would teleport back, even though it's telling us to force it to drop, but we're not holding it, so it doesn't matter. And yeah, so it'll do this every single time. And this was the big difference from the last video. The last video, that drop method wasn't in there. And so what would happen was without dropping it, it would teleport back for a brief moment. It would touch this and it would teleport back for maybe a frame or however long the update period is. But because the game still detects that you're holding it, it constantly wants to teleport this object in front of your hand. So as soon as it would teleport back, it would teleport right back to your hand, and there was no way to prevent that. So now by dropping it, it's no longer teleporting back to our hand, and it goes right to where we want it. So great, that's working. Now all we need to do is the thing I was explaining earlier. We just need to make it so our play area is surrounded by these things. So we're just gonna take this trigger, and we're gonna scale it to match to basically make walls. We're gonna match it to our play area. So I'm gonna make it 10 by 10 by probably 0.2. We want it pretty thin. That way, if the mug falls in this area, VR users probably won't have an issue. We don't want it paper thin, because that might cause issues, but we want it as thin as we can make it. So we're gonna put this over here, and I'm using Control D to duplicate these. So duplicate and move it over here. Control D again, I'm bringing it to the center, and I pressed E to bring up this rotate. No, and I'm lagging because my build control panel is open, so I'm gonna close that. I'm gonna rotate it there. I'm sorry, I'm doing a lot here. I'm pulling on this to rotate, and then I'm holding down Control to make it snap. And I'm also holding down Control to make it snap to segments. And there we go. That's the walls done. But we also want to do a ceiling to the area, because while we don't have jumping setup in this world, there are ways players can either have like a really tall avatar, or there are ways that people can make avatars float upwards even in non jumping worlds and stuff like that. So we want to make a ceiling to it, and then also we want to make it so it's underneath the floor ways. We don't want it too close to the floor, because we don't want people actually accidentally like hitting it on the floor and then it teleporting back, but we want it just underneath so people can't force it through the floor try to get rid of it. Cool. So we might as well do another build now, even though it takes a little bit of time to build, just to see how that goes. So we're making a new build now. And the only thing we've changed so far is instead of having a weird box on the ground that if you put the mug into, it'll teleport back, we've surrounded the area we don't want the mug to leave. Cool. So we can see our area surrounded, and if I go over here and try to leave, you'll see that the mug does not want to leave. It'll always teleport back. So all these walls work. I don't have a way to force it through the floor right now, but let's say a VR user laid on the floor and tried to push it through the ground, it would respawn then. And then if someone did anything to get it to the ceiling, there it is. It's right back. So this is perfect for what we were doing. This is a finished product. One more last thing I will note. Let's say that the spawn point is actually outside this room. And we'll do this. We'll go ahead and make this. But like if you're good where you are here, then cool. But let's say the spawn point is out here. It's what I mentioned earlier, that if you're holding this and then you respawn, which I can't do because I'm not in VR, but VR users can, then, you know, that'd be an issue because they would then respawn and still be holding it and they'd be outside this area. So what you want to do in that case is you want to take another one of these triggers, and I'm just gonna hit reset here so it's right in the middle, and this is actually where our spawn is. Because I don't have a way to respawn and be out here to test it, I'm just going to just make a trigger at the spawn. I believe that's where the spawn is. Yeah, okay, that's the spawn point. So if I do a build of this, apologies for the waiting time. Cool, so now you see that this trigger is here surrounding spawn, and what will happen is when you respawn, which I'll show you, when I respawn I'm inside this trigger, and so that actually does trigger the on enter trigger, because when you respawn you're teleporting there, but it knows that you've entered this trigger, so it just goes back and you enter spawn and it'll teleport back. You wouldn't want it in a situation like this where, you know, the spawn's actually in the room, but if the spawn was outside the room that you wanted to keep this in, you'd want to put this there. And yeah, that's actually it. That's the whole problem solved. I didn't go over a lot of things that I did in the other video. I tried my best to like impart as much knowledge as I could in that video. I did here too, but I skipped over a lot of things. So if you're interested in learning more and seeing how I did it before without that drop object or drop action, I recommend watching that video. It'll probably be very helpful, and if not, at least you'll have learned something. But anyway, I hope I helped you out with this one at least. And yeah, I can't wait to see your finished world with all the beautiful pens kept in one place. See ya.